Top wrestlers Jim Ross hated on commentaries. Jim Ross is easily one of the most legendary commentators in the history of the WWE. You know how most people believe that Stone Cold is the GOAT of wrestlers? Well, Jim is pretty much the Stone Cold of commentators in wrestling. With his impressive and legendary calls, Jim has easily etched his name in wrestling lore. But one thing that really caused him to stand out is the passion with which he makes his calls. Jim was pretty much the voice of the fans. He seemed to know what they wanted, and he immediately echoed that in his calls. Over the years, Jim has made a name for himself with his personal, passionate calls. And in this video, we'll be looking at a few wrestlers who got the brutal end of his passion. The Dudley Boys. The Dudley Boys are easily among the most impressive tag teams ever to grace the WWE stage. Devon and Bubba Ray Dudley tore the stage up when they emerged, quickly becoming a dominant force in tag team matches and making a name for themselves thanks to a legendary rivalry with the Hardy Boys. One of the major reasons why the Dudleys were so popular was their pioneering of the use of tables in WWE. Prior to these guys, tables were hardly used in the sport, but with their brash brand of brutality, they took pride in putting their opponents through tables and causing them immense pain. Here's the thing though, Jim Ross wasn't necessarily a fan of this. Maybe because the Dudleys were so brutal, or maybe because he just wasn't used to seeing tables being part of the sport. But Jim absolutely detested the Dudleys for their antics, so much so that he regularly referred to them as those damn Dudleys.
Those damn Dudley brothers! The damn Dudleys! I can't say that I have any compassion at all for those damn Dudleys!
It got even worse when you consider the fact that the Dudleys didn't seem to have an issue with putting women through tables as well. These guys were all about that action, and Jim never let an opportunity to rip into the half-brothers slide. Tori. Relationships in the WWE aren't necessarily a novelty. We've seen them time and again. Brie Bella and Daniel Bryan, Nikki Bella and John Cena, Seth Rollins and Becky Lynch. The list is pretty extensive, to be fair. Now, some of these relationships actually extend into real life. However, some of them are majorly just props for the WWE to use in creating storylines. Back in the day, even Kane got a little bit of action as well when he was locked in a brief relationship with Tori. From the start, the relationship between Tori and Kane seemed pretty off. It was one of those types of things that really confused the WWE universe. No one really knew how this pairing would work, and it seemed doomed from the start, to be fair. Well, it didn't take long for things to get chippy between the pair, and they eventually broke up in devastating fashion as Tori betrayed Kane to join DX. The move was as shocking as it was heartbreaking, and Jim definitely did not take lightly to that. Going forward, Jim would refer to Tori as Jezebel and deride her at every chance he got for her decision to betray Kane. Eric Bischoff. Eric might not have been a wrestler per se, but he definitely merits a mention on this list. When you're looking at people who Jim Ross hated with a burning passion for wrestling, it's just impossible not to mention this guy. Despite working for the WCW, Eric's profile as a promoter and show producer was off the chart, and as soon as the WWE cemented its hold on American wrestling, they hired him to become the general manager of Raw, and this guy literally got in and switched everything up. The issue between Eric and Jim actually stemmed from the fact that Eric had some animosity with Stone Cold. And considering that Stone Cold and Jim were very close friends, let's just say that Jim got a little of these stray bullets coming from the boss. Basically, Eric made life a living hell for Jim. From putting him in harm's way to compromising his position in the WWE, Eric made sure that Jim never had a moment of peace. But in true fashion, Jim was also not one to take any of this lying down. His commentary on Eric only got meaner, and he never shied away from tearing Eric a new one. When Eric eventually lost favor with the top brass at WWE, Jim was right there to laugh in his face. Boy, talk about a man who definitely held a grudge. Kane. You would want to think that Jim had a bit of sympathy for Kane after Tori dumped him, but you'd be absolutely wrong. Despite the tiff he had with his girlfriend, Kane also ended up being on the receiving end of Jim's ire several times. The beef between these two men really began when Jim interviewed Kane for a segment, and Kane got so angry that he literally put the hurt on Jim. That interview segment got so tense that Kane literally set Jim on fire. After this fiery incident, Jim let Kane have it any time he could. He'd mock Kane's appearance, talk smack about him in public, and even go ahead to goad the big red monster into fights a few times. You know, this whole thing just gives you a little insight into the type of man that Jim was. It really didn't matter your size or stature in the WWE. If Jim did not like you, he'd never back down or pretend that he did. Vince and Stephanie McMahon. They might not be wrestlers as well, but Vince and Stephanie have climbed into the ring and dueled enough times to be qualified for this list, and their feud with Jim was one of the most defining rivalries of his career. So she merits a mention for sure. When Stephanie McMahon stepped on the scene, everyone pretty much thought the same thing. This was just the boss's daughter who got a job because daddy said so. And while Steph has grown to become quite a competent executive in her own right, you can't necessarily fault members of the WWE Universe for thinking this at the time. Well, like I said, Jim had a superpower of understanding what the WWE Universe thought at every point. And considering that Stephanie herself was also stepping into the villain role, Jim was more than happy to let her know her place. It also didn't help matters that Jim and Vince were never particularly on the same page most of the time. Mr. McMahon loves taking advantage of everyone, and Jim made it a personal mission to always counter him whenever he got the opportunity. So what do you get when you have two egotistical men with big personalities in the same room? Beef, of course. For years and years and segments, Jim made no effort to hide his disdain for Vince, and that pretty much spread to every other member of the McMahon family as well. Whenever their paths crossed, you can bet that Jim would be ready with fire and brimstone, ready to rain on the McMahon family parade. Triple H. Would it really be a video talking about Jim Ross and his many feuds without mentioning Triple H? When it comes to the greatest wrestlers of all time, there are people who would put Triple H atop their rankings, but while it's debatable if Hunter is really the GOAT, I can say unequivocally that this man is the undisputed leader among the people who have had a beef with Jim Ross. Whenever he disliked someone, Jim would call them an SOB, but of all the SOBs he said, none really rang as strong as when he called Triple H. With the Attitude Era cementing the WWE as the biggest brand in wrestling, the brand really needed people who could act in the villain role, and let me tell you, Triple H was undoubtedly one of the best of the best. From backstabbing his partners to his on-again, off-again relationship with Stephanie McMahon and more, Triple H seemed like the perfect opportunist in the WWE, and this means that he was disliked by a lot of people, including and especially Jim. Things got so testy between the two men that they even became physical with each other. Triple H assaulted Jim several times, and Jim himself was all too happy to return the favor when it was convenient enough. It's always fun seeing people who aren't wrestlers try their hand in the ring, and when it came to countering Triple H, Jim was all too happy to ignore his old age and inexperience in the ring just so he could get his hands on his nemesis. It ended well sometimes, and it ended pretty badly at other junctures.